You get an email from the teacher, or your child gets into the car and says, "No one listens to me." And almost immediately, your mind starts working. You can see what may have happened. You can anticipate where this probably will go. And you're already thinking about the email, the meeting, the explanation. Especially if you are a gifted woman yourself, you may notice the mismatch before anyone else does. And you may also remember what it felt like to be misunderstood or underestimated. So of course, you want to protect your child. But then comes the harder question. If I step in every time, will my child ever learn to speak for herself? And if I step back, am I failing her? Today, I want to help you answer one question. What kind of support does my child need from me in this moment? And I want to give you a simple rule about when to advocate and when not to advocate. Welcome to the Power to Flourish podcast, where science meets the art of a beautiful life. I'm Dr. Andrea Line, positive psychologist, giftedness expert and coach, and modern-day spiritual godmother to brilliant, deep-feeling women. This isn't just another self-help podcast. It's a sanctuary, a sacred space to come back to yourself. Each week, we'll explore the emotional experience of gifted, sensitive women and what it means to live a life that feels as beautiful as it may look. Because flourishing isn't a luxury, it's your birthright, and your life is waiting. This is the Power to Flourish podcast. Welcome back to the Power to Flourish. I'm Dr. Andrea Line, and this episode is closing out our August series on back to school, parenting gifted kids, and being a gifted mother. It has been really fun to do this, and I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed these episodes, these topics, if you want me to talk more about parenting, it's a topic that I teach and talk about a lot in my coaching because I do a lot of parent coaching still, but I haven't talked about it much on the podcast yet. So that's what I thought we would do this August. So we started a few episodes ago. You can go back and listen if you haven't yet, but we began by talking about why motherhood can feel different for gifted women. And then we looked at what parents need to understand as gifted children, specifically return to school. And then last week, we explored the very personal experience, something I can relate to, and the very unique intersection of raising a child whose intensity and sensitivity and abilities may reflect parts of your own story back to you. And all of that comes together in today's conversation about advocacy. Because advocacy is rarely just about deciding whether you're going to send that email, right? Sometimes the situation is genuinely urgent and your child may be unsafe or unable to access appropriate support or facing a power imbalance she or he cannot reasonably navigate alone. And sometimes your child needs you beside her, not taking over, which we might be apt to do, but helping her understand what is happening, find the right words, prepare for a conversation, or participate in a meeting. Now, obviously, this depends on the age and developmental stage of your child, but I'm going to speak broadly today for parents, regardless of the age of your kid. Sometimes, this is often the most uncomfortable possibility that is your child may need enough room to struggle and make a mistake and experience a consequence or discover that she could do something difficult. It's so huge. So the goal is not to become less involved. Hear me out. I know some of you are like, I can't just step back. I get it. Because you're the kind of woman who like stepping back may not be a familiar place for you, right? But the goal is to offer the right amount and the right kind of support. So as we've talked about before, we are going to start with curiosity, not the case that you're already building in your mind. So here's something I've noticed about very thoughtful, highly capable parents, which are basically all the parents I've worked with over the years. We can begin solving a problem before we even fully understand it, right? Our minds, we move quickly, we connect dots. Usually there's like time pressure, but we also are just quick and we recognize the patterns. And sometimes, a lot of the times, we're absolutely right. But when we move too quickly from our child's first report to a fully formed conclusion, we can miss information that would actually help us advocate more effectively. I can speak here, by the way, if you're new to this program, I am speaking both as a parent, being in the shoes of needing to advocate for my gifted daughter, twice exceptional daughter. I can also speak as a school staff person. I was a therapist. I had also been a teacher at different points. I can speak to it from that end. And then also I can understand this as a school administrator, because there was a time in my life where I also did that. So I have been in lots of these different roles, and I can empathize and relate to each one. So let's say a child says, the teacher hates me. The teacher hates me. Especially if it's a pattern, right? Now, I would probably not dismiss that, because something emotionally important is being communicated. Maybe your child feels embarrassed or singled out or unseen. I've worked with plenty of kids who thought that the teacher hated them because, they weren't doing things perfectly. So their perfectionism was telling themselves a story, right? And sometimes they can truly be in a classroom that doesn't feel quite very safe emotionally. But the point is, the teacher hates me is still just the beginning of the conversation, right? It's not necessarily the full picture. So before deciding what we're going to do as a parent, we have to slow down. We've got to slow the process enough to become curious and get more information. What actually happened? Was this one interaction, or has it been happening repeatedly, right? What did the teacher say? What did your child say? What happened immediately before or after? And then noting, and maybe this is not something your child tells you, but something that you're paying attention to. How is this affecting your child's learning or their sleep or their mood? Or maybe it's their, willingness to attend school. What has your child already tried? Like, there's so many questions. And maybe the most important question for your child is, what does your child want to happen next? When they start with, my teacher hates me, like, what is it? What's it in their heart? Like, what is it that they want? What need is not being met, right? And that last question matters so much, because sometimes in our wonderful intentions as parents and fast thinkers and problem solvers, we are working toward an outcome our child didn't even ask for. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been there? A gifted child particularly may be highly verbal and still lose access to language when upset. You got to understand this. They're still children and they're still human. So even highly verbal adults can sometimes lose access to language in the same way, like when they're really upset, right? And another child may describe events with tremendous conviction, but without all of the context. So a child who is disruptive, for example, after finishing their classwork early, they may need more challenge. And they may also need help learning how to handle boredom without disrupting other students. Both may be true, right? More than one thing is often true in these situations. So that's why I say curiosity is not passivity. It's a very important first part of strong advocacy. I've worked with so many gifted students over the years and their families. And sometimes on the surface, what the need looked like, once we did a little bit more digging, it turned out to be something completely different. And so this is why it's so important, because if we just jump to assuming we know what the problem is that we're solving, we can be really effective. We can have that. We can send that email to the teacher or the school principal or whatever, right? We can have the conversation with that other parent whose kid said XYZ. We could do that. But if we don't really actually know what's needed, we may think we solved the problem when actually we didn't. And so our child is left still having a problem and a need, right? So the more specific we can become, the more effective we tend to be. And we can become more specific when we understand more specifically what's going on. So a really common example would be something like hearing from your child that they're having a major problem with X class, right? And let's say this child is actually, 15 years old. So they're a little angsty, they got a little bit of an attitude problem, and that's what's presenting. And maybe they don't like the teacher or whatever it is. So a problem with the class, yeah, that could be lots of things. It could be, I don't like the teacher. I don't like the way they teach. I don't like the jokes they tell. I don't like it could be a million things. We don't really know. But when it gets clear, for example, the problem is my child is finishing the assigned work in 10 minutes, has no approved next task to work on, and they're starting to distract nearby students because also maybe this child who is bored, finished with their work, doesn't have anything else to work on. Maybe they also struggle with impulse control because they have a diagnosis or maybe undiagnosed ADHD. Any of these things are things that I've happened, and I have seen in my work with gifted individuals. That level of specificity gives everyone something concrete to work with, right? The teacher can begin planning. The 15-year-old can start communicating and getting needs met. Like there's so many things that we can do. And so clarity lowers the emotional temperature usually without minimizing the concern. We get really clear. So now I want to talk about a pattern I see often, again, in very loving, competent parents, particularly moms, and that is overfunctioning. We've talked about overfunctioning. We've talked about over-responsibility. So if this is something that you recognize that you're in yourself, do not take this as a personal attack. I'm just describing how it comes out and what it can look like in the role of parenting. Overfunctioning simply means that we begin taking more responsibility for another person's tasks or emotions or outcomes than is actually ours to carry. And it usually comes from very good places. And I can relate. I'll raise my hand. I am a classic historical overfunctioner, and I earned that really honestly growing up in the environment that I did. So you may have also. And so as a mother, we have to be aware, right? We love our children. We see what needs to happen. We know how to make things move. We know how to make it happen. And we may also at times feel urgency because we've watched adults misunderstand our child before, perhaps, or maybe because no one stepped in for us when we needed help. So we just send the email before really asking what our child needs or wants. We repeatedly rescue the forgotten assignment. Is this you? We manage every deadline. We explain every misunderstanding. And we speak through the entire meeting while our child sits quietly beside us, again, depending on the age. And I will say, again, speaking as someone who's worked in the school and being the parent, oftentimes our intervention works, quote unquote, and the problem gets solved faster or seemingly does. But a faster solution, even if it's the right solution, even if it's an effective solution, is not always the same thing as a stronger, more resilient child, right? So a question I find very helpful is, am I working harder on this problem than my child is? My goodness, how many moms have I had to coach, especially when they have teenagers or young adults? This is a real tricky balance. This can be really hard, especially if you have ingrained patterns. And so that question, again, it's not meant to shame you. It's not meant to make us feel bad. There are many situations in which the parent should be working harder, right? Because maybe the child is very young or is emotionally overwhelmed, or maybe it's a situation that is unsafe, or maybe they're disabled in some way, or again, oftentimes, especially with school, they're facing an institution with far more power. But we still need to be careful. Because if we're consistently more invested in the solution than our child seems to be, that is information, right? It's information worth noticing. And sometimes our help begins to communicate, even if we don't mean for it to do this, it communicates. And I've seen this so many times in families I've worked with. A really well-intentioned mom will say, not explicitly, but in her behaviors, will communicate this to her child. This is too much for you. Or basically the equivalent of, I don't trust you to handle this. I don't think you can handle this. We don't think we're saying that, but that's basically what we're saying. And gifted children are especially complicated here because Their intellectual ability can make them appear older than they are in some moments, while their emotional intensity or executive function challenges or anxiety or asynchronous development in general can make them need much more support in other areas. And so we cannot determine what they should handle based only on how articulate they sound. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So the goal is not to suddenly withdraw and say, fine, you deal with it. It's your responsibility, right? That can be really, really cruel sometimes, especially when a kid has sort of gotten used to you always being there to help. So don't do that. Don't like pendulum swing to the other side. That's not the goal. The middle ground is supported ownership. We can remain emotionally available without automatically assuming control. This is really huge for a lot of the moms that I work with. How do we remain emotionally available for our child without automatically assuming control and thereby responsibility? And that brings us to a distinction I think every parent needs, every parent. And that is the difference between productive struggle and harmful overwhelm. Productive struggle, and if this was not a podcast, I would draw a picture because there's like the sweet spot, right, of stress. Productive struggle or stress is difficult, but it's manageable. It might be a little bit of a stretch. In fact, just like when you're lifting weights, you want a progressive overload if you want the muscles to build. So we want that productive struggle. It might be a conversation that's going to feel awkward with a teacher. Or maybe it's allowing the space for your child to be disappointed when they get a grade back on a test that they did not really prepare for well, and it's a disappointing grade, It doesn't fit. And instead of trying to rush to fix the grade, we let them experience that disappointment. It's a good learning moment. Maybe it's a project that requires a level of persistence that they haven't had the chance to develop yet. Or maybe it's a minor, repairable social misunderstanding that your child can also learn from. Your child may dislike it. She may be frustrated, upset, mad at you maybe for not, jumping in to solve it. But the challenge is developmentally possible. And that is a part where sometimes it's helpful to get some outside, if you're not sure, get some outside perspective, whether that's, again, working with someone like me, a parent coach who I've worked with, so many families and so many kids, or maybe it's asking a teacher or looking around at kind of like other kids around your child's age, right? Like we want to make sure that what we're asking, certainly not going to be the same for a 5-year-old as it would be for a 12-year-old, right? So the key is that the challenge is developmentally possible. Support is available. The mistakes that they're making are recoverable. And there's something she can learn by participating in the process, right? Harmful overwhelm, I would also use the word depending on what it is. It could be some trauma. It could be excessive stress, severe, even chronic stress is different, right? Bullying, a long-standing pattern of bullying, it's not productive struggle. Discrimination, it's not productive struggle. Chronic humiliation by a teacher or inaccessible work or denied accommodations or severe school refusal or distress that is so intense that a child cannot function are not opportunities to build resilience. Let me say that again. These extreme situations is not the time. Now, we do want to support our kids in a very specific way to help them build resilience. But resilience develops through supported difficulty, not through avoidable suffering. So I want you to ask yourself, is my child uncomfortable but still basically regulated? And maybe they might be a little dysregulated, but it's uncomfortable. It's unpleasant. Is this something she could do with coaching from me or a teacher or a therapist or like practice over and over? And some kids do need, especially with younger kids, need a lot more practice and coaching, like direct, explicit instruction. And then finally, can she reflect on what happened afterward? And is there a reasonable chance that some skill or some increased courage or confidence could grow here from this? Or is their nervous system so overwhelmed that they can't even access the skills they have? Is safety involved? Is there a serious power imbalance? Is access to learning or appropriate support being denied? When the answer is yes to that, then adult involvement is not being overprotective. It is absolutely necessary. So the question is not merely like, is this hard or uncomfortable? The question is, can this kind of hard teach my child something, or is it simply harming her or him? So I want to give you a simple way to think about your role. In any difficult situation, there are really three positions available to us. We can step in, we can step aside, or we can step back. And stepping in means the adult leads. This is appropriate when safety is at risk, when documented support is being denied, or even I would say documented challenge or enrichment is being denied for a gifted kid, bullying or discrimination when that's occurring, or the child is simply just too young, or maybe they're too overwhelmed to communicate, and the stakes and power imbalance are simply too great. Your child should never have to prove independence by handling alone what requires adult authority, right? So that is stepping in. Stepping beside means your child participates but does not carry the situation alone. And most situations, as your child is developing, hopefully fall into this category. So you may help him organize what happened. You might rehearse what he needs or wants to say in a particular, situation with a friend, or maybe it's a teacher. You may attend the meeting and, invite your child to speak first. Regardless of the age, I think this is such a wonderful thing, especially if it's at school. You might help draft an email, but helping her contributing the words or the ideas before you press send. Like, you're not doing it all for them, right? This is often where the most growth occurs because the child is supported, still has meaningful ownership. They get to have the experience of self-advocating with help, because it can certainly be, it's unfamiliar territory to most kids. So it's a beautiful thing when we can do that. And then finally, there are times to step back. You allow your child to have the conversation. You allow a recoverable consequence. You allow a teacher to respond before you intervene. You let your child experience disappointment without immediately trying to remove it. Stepping back does not mean you're just disappearing, but it does mean remaining available while resisting the urge, because we often struggle with this, resisting the urge to take over a task your child is capable of beginning to own. And if you have a kid and you're like, oh no, my kid can't do it, I would challenge you. I would gently, lovingly challenge you to give a little bit more space for your child to begin to own it. They may fall down. They may fail, quote unquote fail, right? But they're never going to learn, and they can't begin to own it if you never let them. So a simple way to remember this is step in, 2, step beside for learning and growth, and 3, step back for ownership. This is really important developmentally. And again, I've watched and worked with kids very young up to young adult and even adulthood. And like the amount of support, we call it scaffolding, it changes as they begin to develop more and more skills. And that's a beautiful thing, because we want our kids to be able to advocate for themselves as they get older, right? And it's also important to note, because gifted children develop unevenly, right? We've talked about this before, that asynchronous development. Your position may change from one situation to another. It's not like, oh, we've hit a certain thing, and so now I just step back all the time and they own it. No, because that's not typically how this works. It's contextual. So the same child who can independently email a teacher about an assignment may completely shut down during some kind of conflict with their peers, right? So you've got to navigate this. You've got to be sensitive to the nuance. I've seen time and time again, it's like a teenager, a gifted, highly verbal teenager who can debate an adult with like remarkable sophistication, and yet they still need help identifying what they're feeling. You know what I mean? So this is not inconsistency. This is not about being inconsistent. It's actually being very responsive in your parenting approach. And finally, I just want to round out by talking about how do we teach a child to advocate? Because sometimes we assume that gifted children should naturally know how to advocate because they're bright or maybe they're really articulate and they can convince us that maybe they are capable. But self-advocacy is a developmental skill and it has to be taught and practiced. So we begin by helping the child name the experience. For example, when I finish my work early, I lose focus, right? And then they identify the need. I think I need something meaningful to do, so I'm bored. Then they're going to practice a respectful request. When I finish the assignment, could I work on the extension project or whatever it may be, right? So we want to help them. We can help by rehearsing, in the car on the way to school. You can role play, a teacher's possible response. You can also just remind your child that self-advocacy does not mean they will always get the answer they want. Right? This is really important, especially for highly verbal gifted kids who are kind of like sometimes known for like beating down the door until the adults just like give in because they can't. They're like, okay, I'm so tired. I can't. We're just going to give in. So self-advocacy is important, but we don't want to turn them into people who bully other people to get what they want, right? So there's a balance there. And finally, what do we do when we really do need to contact the teacher or the school? Some of you probably already have to do this. And I know that school meetings can be emotionally loaded, especially if you already feel that your child has not been fully understood or seen, and especially if you've had past experiences yourself in school. So you got to look at all of that stuff before you go into this. But there is a way to collaborate well with the school or a teacher without abandoning your concern. And I have worked with, again, so many parents who've done a beautiful job of this. You don't want to minimize the serious concern, right? So it means presenting the concern to whoever the school official might be or teacher in a form that makes shared problem solving more possible. And if you're a teacher, you know this too. Like you can sometimes deal with parents that are very, very, very difficult, right? And they come in and kind of like dump the problem on you and like you just gotta, the way it's done doesn't feel good. So here are some things to consider, especially when you're like opening up the conversation. You want to include 5 things. First, what you have observed personally. And then second, the impact on your child. A genuine question about what the teacher is seeing, not accusation, but a genuine question, a shared goal, right? Can we come up with a shared goal together? And then finally, what is one small thing that you could try? So for example, let's say you're going to see a teacher and you say something like, we've noticed that our little Maya is spending more than an hour rewriting very short assignments, and she is sleeping less on those nights. She says she's afraid one mistake will, significantly lower her grade. What are you noticing in class? And, and then you have a conversation, and we'd like to help her produce careful work without reinforcing what looks like, perfectionism to us. Would you be open to trying a time limit or a one draft expectation for a couple weeks, and then we can compare notes, right? So something like that. I know that's really kind of simple and I condense it, of course, but notice that it doesn't weaken the parent's concern. It's still being very clear. It makes the concern observable. It invites information, conversation, and then it creates a next step everyone can evaluate. And it can be, I encourage you to be warm and very clear, right? Collaborative and still firm. Don't feel like you can't make a request or can't ask to problem solve with the school. And in my experience, it's really helpful to assume positive intent at the beginning without ignoring evidence if the situation does not improve. So again, one thing, just if you take away anything from this part, is bring a problem that you can observe and then a goal you can share. because that gives you and the school or the teacher, that gives you somewhere to go together. So today's takeaway, if you're the kind of person who jumps into action real quick to advocate, before you send that email today or request the meeting, I want to offer just a few questions, again, to help you pause. What is the actual level of risk or harm in this situation? What part of this problem belongs to my child developmentally? And how can I empower my child before I take over? How do we empower them? What is the least intrusive support that is likely to be effective? That last question is important because we are not looking for the least support possible. We are looking for the least intrusive support that is still effective. Because sometimes that will be a direct, firm adult intervention. Sometimes it will be coaching and standing nearby. And sometimes it will be waiting, 24 hours or more, letting your child try something first and then agreeing on when you're going to reassess. And you can always increase support if the situation continues. Good advocacy is not measured by how quickly we remove every discomfort. It's measured by how wisely our support protects what must be protected while strengthening our child's capacity over time, whether your child is gifted or not. But I think particularly with gifted children, this can get a little tricky because there will be moments where you need to speak firmly. And then there are going to be moments where it's better to stand beside. And there will be moments when love looks like taking one step back and allowing your child to discover what she or he can do. And that balance, like I said, will change with age and context, emotional capacity, and the resources your child has in that particular moment. So your child does not need you to disappear in order to become capable. And your child does not need you to take over in order to be effective in this world or to feel loved by you, right? There's this nice middle place, hopefully, where there's enough protection for safety, enough support for learning, and enough room for their ownership. And I get it. The middle place, it's not always obvious, and you will not always get it exactly right. None of us ever do. This is it's parenting. It's like you're experimenting along the way and you're just doing the best you can. But if you have this self-awareness and if you take the pause and you examine your own urgency and you listen carefully and you're open to adjusting your support, I think that really matters, right? The goal is to really help your child gradually become someone who can understand her own needs and use her voice and ask for help and tolerate difficulty, right? Manageable difficulty, and participate in shaping her own life. And that is one of the most meaningful forms of advocacy I think we can offer. So again, this was a full, meaty episode today, as were some of the other ones this month. So if you haven't listened to all of the back to school series in the month of August, I highly recommend that you do if you're a parent. And if you're not a parent and you've been listening along the way, maybe you're going to be a parent one day. I'm sure you know parents. So I would be so honored if you would share this with a parent you love and know that they could benefit from this information. I will see you back here next week. We are jumping into my favorite month. It's my birthday month. It's my anniversary month. It's, in my mind, back to school month, September. August is I know it's a transition, but September, we're in full back to school mode. So I might buy myself some new pens and a cute back to school outfit. I hope you have a lovely week, and I will see you back here next week. Until then, keep flourishing. Thank you for listening to the Power to Flourish podcast. I hope today's conversation left you feeling more seen, more supported, and more deeply connected to yourself. And if this episode resonated, would you take a moment to subscribe, leave a review, or share it with a friend? It's one of the best ways to help this work reach the women who need it most. You'll find show notes, links, and resources from today's episode at powertoflourish.com. And now just a quick reminder, this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. It's not therapy, medical advice, or a substitute for professional support. And listening doesn't make me your therapist or doctor, though if you're looking for a coach, you know where to find me. All right, beautiful one, that's it for now. Until next time, trust yourself, honor your gifts, and keep flourishing.